Josiah Henson's life began not with choice, celebration, or protection, but with ownership stamped onto his existence before he could speak or walk. He was born around 1789 on a plantation in Maryland, into a world where his first breath already belonged to someone else, where his name, his body, and even his future were considered movable property. There was no memory of freedom to inherit, no story of ancestors who had lived without chains, only the inherited silence of generations who had learned that survival meant obedience. His earliest surroundings were not shaped by toys or warmth, but by fear that moved like a shadow through every corner of the slave quarters. His mother carried him on her back while working long hours, knowing that even her children were not hers to keep. Josiah's father was a strong, proud man, but strength meant nothing in a system designed to crush it. One day, after resisting an overseer's cruelty, his father was beaten so brutally that one of his ears was cut off as punishment, a public warning meant to terrorize every enslaved soul who witnessed it. That same day, Josiah's father was sold away, torn from his family without ceremony, without mercy, and without goodbye. Josiah was still a child, but the image of his mother collapsing in grief, screaming as her husband disappeared, forever, burned itself into his memory. That moment taught him his first lesson about slavery. Love was a liability, and attachment was a weakness the system would exploit without hesitation. His mother was left alone with her children, constantly fearing that they too would be sold, separated, scattered like objects across distant lands. Every sunrise brought uncertainty. Every footstep from a white man carried the possibility of loss. Josiah grew up watching human beings priced, traded, and discussed with the same indifference reserved for livestock. Children were inspected, women were valued for their ability to give birth, and men were measured by strength alone. Even as a boy, he understood that childhood did not exist for someone like him. Hunger was constant, clothing was thin and worn, and sleep came only after exhaustion overpowered fear. Nights were filled with whispers of pain, prayers spoken softly so they would not invite punishment, and the distant cries of those being whipped for offenses as small as hesitation or exhaustion. Education was forbidden, curiosity was dangerous, and silence was a survival skill. Yet Josiah observed everything. He watched how masters spoke, how overseers ruled through terror, and how enslaved people learned to read moods rather than words. He saw his mother endure humiliation and loss without surrendering her humanity, and through her he learned resilience, even as the world tried to beat it out of him. He learned that kindness from a slaveholder was never kindness at all, only a temporary pause in cruelty, and that promises were weapons designed to keep slaves compliant. From a very young age, Josiah learned to work not just with his hands, but with his mind, anticipating violence before it arrived, understanding that survival depended on knowing when to bow and when to endure silently. He learned to swallow anger because anger invited death, to hide tears because tears invited ridicule, and to bury hope deep enough that it would not betray him. But even buried, hope did not die. Somewhere beneath the fear and brutality, something in him remained awake, watching, remembering, storing every injustice like a wound that refused to heal. The system tried to reduce him to an animal, but it failed to erase his awareness. He saw how religion was used to justify bondage, how the Bible was twisted to demand obedience, and how prayers spoken by slaveholders ended with the crack of a whip. He saw how enslaved mothers sang to their children not just lullabies, but warnings, coded messages about survival, about endurance, about the cruelty of the world they were inheriting. Josiah grew tall and strong, but strength did not protect him from pain, it only increased expectations. He was put to work early, his small hands hardened by labor long before they should have known such weight. Every task carried the unspoken truth that no matter how well he performed, he would never earn ownership of himself. The plantation was a place where time stretched endlessly, where days blurred into years, and where the future was a dark, unknowable threat. Yet Josiah's mind kept working, connecting patterns, recognizing lies, understanding that slavery was not just physical control but psychological imprisonment designed to convince its victims that escape was impossible. He watched older slaves who had given up hope, whose eyes were empty, whose movements were automatic, and he silently promised himself that he would not become like them. He did not yet know how, but he sensed that remembering the truth of what he was witnessing mattered. His childhood was shaped by loss, fear, and violence, but it was also shaped by observation, by the quiet formation of a consciousness that refused to fully surrender. When he later spoke of his early years, he described them not as a single trauma, but as a constant pressure, a life lived under the weight of knowing that at any moment everything could be taken again. His father's disappearance was not just a personal tragedy, it was a warning carved into his identity, proof that slavery's cruelty was not accidental, but deliberate, calculated, and merciless. By the time Josiah Henson reached adolescence, he had already lived through enough suffering to last several lifetimes, yet his spirit remained unbroken, shaped but not destroyed. Ed by the world that sought to own him, his birth in chains was not just the beginning of his life, it was the foundation of a memory that would later shake a nation, even if the nation never fully learned his name. As Josiah Henson grew into adulthood, the plantation system tightened its grip around him in a different way, no longer treating him as a fragile child, but reshaping him into a tool meant to serve its interests with efficiency and control. His physical strength, sharp awareness, and ability to understand instructions quickly set him apart from others, and in a world built on exploitation, these traits did not bring freedom but greater responsibility under bondage. He was soon placed in positions of trust, given tasks that required leadership, and expected to enforce discipline among fellow slaves. To the masters, this was seen as reward and promotion, proof that loyalty could elevate a man even in chains. To Josiah, it was a quiet torment, because every step upward came with deeper moral conflict. He was expected to command people who shared his pain, his fear, and his blood, and to become the voice of authority for a system that had already stolen his family and his youth. Each order he gave felt like a betrayal, yet refusal meant punishment or death. The plantation rewarded obedience not with dignity but with illusion, allowing him slightly better clothing, marginally more food, and a fragile sense of security that could vanish without warning. The slaveholders praised him, spoke of him as reliable and intelligent, and used him as living proof that slavery could be humane if a slave simply knew his place. This false praise was designed to break resistance, to turn the enslaved against themselves, and Josiah understood this even as he was trapped within it. He watched how masters manipulated ambition, dangling freedom like a distant mirage, promising Manu. Mission, if he remained faithful, hardworking, and submissive. The promise of freedom was the most powerful weapon they possessed, and Josiah clung to it not because he fully trusted it, but because hope was the only thing that made survival bearable. He labored relentlessly, managing supplies, organizing work, and ensuring productivity, knowing that his performance was constantly observed, judged, and recorded. Yet behind his calm exterior, his mind never stopped questioning the fairness of a world where loyalty earned nothing permanent. He witnessed punishments he could not stop, heard screams he was powerless to silence, and carried the weight of knowing that his relative privilege did not protect those around him. Night after night, he lay awake wrestling with guilt, wondering whether survival under such terms was a form of collaboration or simply another face of captivity. He saw how enslaved people looked at him, some with resentment, others with silent understanding, and he felt the burden of standing between cruelty and chaos, unable to truly dismantle either. As years passed, the promised freedom remained just out of reach, always delayed by excuses, new conditions, or sudden changes of heart. When his master faced financial trouble, Josiah realized how fragile his situation truly was, because trust did not override profit. He was nearly sold away from his wife and children, saved only by circumstance rather than compassion. That moment shattered any remaining belief that loyalty could protect him. He understood then that slavery did not recognize honor, integrity, or service, only ownership. The realization cut deeply because it forced him to confront the truth that no amount of obedience would ever make him equal and no promise would ever outweigh money. Yet even as disillusionment settled in, Josiah continued to observe and learn. He studied human behavior, noticed the weaknesses and fears of slaveholders, and understood how power was maintained through division and intimidation. His intelligence, sharpened by years of survival, became his quiet weapon. He memorized routes, listened to conversations, and absorbed information that others dismissed as meaningless. While outwardly appearing loyal, inwardly he began to detach from the lie that the system sold him. His faith, twisted by slaveholders to demand submission, transformed into something personal and resistant, a belief that injustice could not be eternal. He married, built a family within the narrow confines allowed to him, and felt both joy and terror in becoming a father, knowing that his children inherited his chains. Every time he looked at them, the urgency of freedom grew heavier, because obedience could no longer be justified as mere self-preservation. It now meant condemning the next generation to the same fate. The role of trusted slave became unbearable, a mask he wore to survive while quietly planning for a future beyond the plantation. He saw how the system used him as an example, telling others that good behavior led to reward, while privately denying him the very freedom he had earned through decades of labor. That hypocrisy hardened something inside him. The moment he finally confronted his master about the broken promise, he was met not with justice but with indifference, and the papers that were meant to grant his freedom were dismissed, altered, or rendered meaningless. In that instant, the illusion collapsed completely. Josiah understood that the plantation would never release him willingly, that his life would end in chains if he waited for fairness from an unjust system. The trusted position that once seemed like progress now revealed itself as a carefully designed trap, meant to keep him compliant while extracting maximum value from his bod. And mind. The weight of betrayal did not break him. Instead, it clarified his purpose. Every humiliation, every false promise, every sleepless night formed a quiet resolve. He had learned the inner workings of slavery from the inside, understood its language, its psychology, and its weaknesses. What the masters believed was their greatest success, the creation of a loyal, capable slave, had instead produced a man who could see the system clearly and who knew that true freedom would never be handed to him. It would have to be taken at any cost. The decision to escape did not arrive suddenly, nor was it fueled by reckless courage. It grew slowly, painfully, out of years of betrayal, fear, and unbearable responsibility. Josiah Henson understood better than most what escape truly meant. It was not a heroic sprint toward freedom, but a calculated walk into uncertainty where death, capture, and torture waited at every turn. He had seen what happened to those who failed. Runaways were beaten publicly, mutilated, or sold south as warnings to others. Families were punished for the courage of one. Knowing this, Josiah did not act on impulse. He waited, watched, and prepared in silence, while outwardly continuing the role of the obedient and dependable slave. His greatest fear was not death itself, but the thought of dragging his wife and children into a fate worse than bondage. Yet the realization that staying meant condemning them to permanent enslavement became more terrifying than any risk beyond the plantation. The breaking point came when he understood with final clarity that his master would never free him, that even his children could be sold at any moment to settle a debt or satisfy greed. From that moment on, every sunrise felt like borrowed time, and every night felt like a rehearsal for disappearance. He began to gather fragments of knowledge, directions whispered by other slaves, rumors of safe paths, mentions of sympathetic strangers, vague references to something called the Underground Railroad. It was not a literal railway, but a fragile network of courage, secrecy, and shared humanity, and trusting it meant trusting strangers with one's life. Josiah knew there would be no second chance. One mistake would destroy everything. When the night finally came, it was unremarkable in appearance, dark and quiet, the kind of night where the world seemed asleep. Yet beneath that stillness, every step carried the weight of history. He gathered his family, their belongings minimal because speed mattered more than comfort, and led them away from the only world they had ever known. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no final looks back, only the steady forward motion of people who understood that hesitation could be fatal. As they moved through forests and across fields, every sound became a threat. The snap of a branch, the howl of a dog, the distant echo of hooves could mean capture. His children were too young to fully understand the danger, yet they sensed it in their parents' silence, in the tight grip of Josiah's hand, in the way their mother swallowed her fear and followed without question. Hunger arrived quickly, gnawing at their strength, and exhaustion slowed their steps, but stopping was not an option. Josiah navigated by instinct and fragments of memory, avoiding main roads, following rivers when possible, trusting the stars when nothing else offered guidance. At times despair crept in, whispering that turning back might be safer, but he forced those thoughts away, reminding himself that safety in chains was an illusion. They encountered moments of terror that nearly ended everything. Close calls with slave catchers, sudden movements that sent them hiding in mud or underbrush for hours, barely daring to breathe. Each encounter forced the truth that the law was not their protector but their enemy, and that every mile north was a battle won against an entire system designed to hunt them. When they finally encountered people willing to help, it felt unreal, almost dangerous in its kindness. There were white faces who did not carry whips, hands that offered food without demand, doors that opened instead of slamming shut. Trust came slowly, because betrayal had been the language of Josiah's entire life, but necessity forced faith where certainty did not exist. These helpers gave them shelter, directions, and moments of rest that felt like stolen miracles. Yet even kindness was fragile, because discovery meant punishment not only for the escapees, but for those who aided them. Josiah carried the guilt of endangering others alongside the fear of capture, and that burden weighed heavily on him as the journey stretched on. The closer they came to the border, the more intense the danger became, because slave catchers patrolled those regions aggressively, driven by profit and backed by law. There were moments when Josiah questioned whether freedom was worth the cost, especially when his children grew weak and his wife struggled to continue. But each time doubt surfaced, he remembered his father's mutilation, his mother's screams, the broken promises, and the certainty that staying meant slow spiritual death. Crossing into Canada was not marked by celebration or triumph. It was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There was no visible line in the earth, no trumpet to announce the end of slavery. Yet when Josiah realized that the laws that had hunted him could no longer claim him, the weight he had carried since birth collapsed inward. He wept, not loudly, but with the kind of tears that come from a body finally releasing decades of tension. For the first time, he belonged to himself. But freedom was not instant. Healing. The trauma of pursuit lingered, and the fear of capture did not disappear overnight. Even in Canada, Josiah listened for footsteps, watched shadows, and slept lightly, conditioned by years of danger. Freedom demanded adjustment, because living without a master required redefining identity, responsibility, and purpose. Josiah understood quickly that survival alone was not enough. He had escaped not just for himself, but for those who could not, and that realization transformed relief into obligation. He began working, building stability for his family, learning how to exist in a society that did not legally own him, but still carried prejudice and suspicion. Yet even imperfect freedom felt revolutionary compared to bondage. He watched his children move without fear of sale, saw his wife speak without lowering her eyes, and those simple moments confirmed that every risk had been necessary. The escape did not erase the past, but it reclaimed the future. Josiah Henson had walked into death expecting nothing more than a chance, and instead he emerged into a life where his story could finally be told, not as property, but as testimony. Life in Canada did not unfold as a peaceful ending to Josiah Henson's suffering, but as a demanding new chapter that required strength of a different kind, one that slavery had never allowed him to practice openly. Freedom removed the chains from his body, but it did not erase the scars carved into his memory, nor did it shield him from the responsibility he now felt toward others who were still trapped in bondage. Almost immediately, Josiah recognized that survival alone would be a hollow victory. He had escaped with his family, but thousands remained behind, hunted by the same laws that had once claimed him. Canada offered legal freedom, yet it was a fragile refuge, cold, unfamiliar, and shaped by suspicion toward black refugees who arrived with nothing but trauma and determination. Josiah worked tirelessly, taking on labor wherever it could be found, using the same discipline that slavery had forced upon him, but now for his own survival and dignity. He learned quickly that freedom demanded initiative, planning, and leadership, and those qualities, sharpened under oppression, now began to surface openly. Other escaped slaves gravitated toward him, drawn by his calm authority and the depth of experience written into his voice. He did not present himself as a hero because he understood too well how close he had come to failure, but his story carried power simply because it was true. As more fugitives arrived, exhausted, frightened, and broken, Josiah became a source of guidance, helping them find work, shelter, and a sense of stability in a land that was free but not forgiving. He helped establish settlements for former slaves, places where families could live without fear of separation, where children could grow without learning the sound of the whip before learning their own names. Education became central to his vision because he believed ignorance had been one of slavery's strongest weapons. He supported schools, encouraged literacy, and spoke openly about the need to reclaim not just physical freedom but intellectual and spiritual independence. Over time, Josiah began to write and speak about his experiences, urged by abolitionists who understood that his life was evidence of slavery's brutality and its moral bankruptcy. When he told his story, he did not soften it for comfort. He described the violence, the broken families, the calculated cruelty, and the lies that sustained the system. His words traveled beyond Canada, reaching audiences in the United States and Europe, where debates about slavery were often abstract, removed from the human cost. Josiah's testimony changed that. He was not a statistic or a theory, he was living proof. Among those who encountered his narrative was Harriet Beecher Stowe, a woman searching for a way to communicate the horrors of slavery to a broad audience that might otherwise look away. Josiah's life, along with the stories of others like him, became foundational material for what would become Uncle Tom's Cabin. The novel ignited outrage, empathy, and political tension, shaping public opinion in ways few works of fiction ever had. Yet the transformation of lived experience into literature came with distortion. The character of Uncle Tom, while intended to evoke moral strength, was portrayed as passive, submissive, and defined by suffering rather than resistance. Josiah recognized the gap immediately. The man he had been, the choices he had made, the risks he had taken, did not align with the image that the world now embraced as the symbol of enslaved virtue. While the book helped fuel abolitionist sentiment, it also simplified and softened the reality of resistance, turning a complex human struggle into a digestible moral lesson. Josiah did not publicly attack the work because he understood its value in the larger fight against slavery, but privately and sometimes openly, he expressed frustration that his life had been reduced to a symbol that did not fully represent his strength, intelligence, or defiance. He continued speaking, writing his own autobiography to reclaim his narrative, insisting that enslaved people were not merely victims waiting for salvation, but active agents in their own liberation. His voice grew stronger with age, not quieter. He traveled, lectured, and met with leaders, using his life as a bridge between suffering and action. Yet recognition remained uneven. The character inspired by his story became famous, while the man himself remained largely unknown outside abolitionist circles. This imbalance reflected a deeper discomfort within society, a preference for symbols over real people, for stories that could be consumed without fully confronting the resilience and resistance of those who lived them. Josiah's work expanded beyond testimony into institution building. He helped create communities where former slaves could live with purpose, faith, and mutual support, believing that freedom without structure could collapse under the weight of trauma. His leadership was practical, not romantic, shaped by the understanding that survival required more than ideals. Even as slavery eventually ended in the United States, Josiah did not retreat into quiet satisfaction. He knew that emancipation did not equal equality, and that the legacy of slavery would continue to shape lives long after the legal chains were broken. Watching the world celebrate the end of an institution that had defined his early life, he carried both relief and sorrow, because freedom had arrived too late for many he had known, including his father. In his later years, Josiah reflected on the strange reality that his suffering had helped inspire one of the most influential anti-slavery novels in history, yet his name remained largely absent from popular memory. He accepted this not as personal failure, but as another example of how history often simplifies truth. What mattered to him was not fame, but impact, and in that sense, his life had achieved something extraordinary. He had transformed pain into purpose, survival into leadership, and silence into a voice that echoed far beyond the plantation where he was born. The man behind Uncle Tom was not a passive figure bowed under suffering. He was a strategist, a leader, and a witness who understood that stories could change the world, even when they did not always honor their source. As Josiah Henson moved into the final decades of his life, the weight memory became both a burden and a responsibility that he could not set down. He lived long enough to see slavery formally abolished in the United States, a moment that many celebrated as the end of a great moral crime. Yet for Josiah, it was a victory shadowed by grief, because freedom arrived after generations had already been destroyed. He thought often of his father, mutilated and sold away, of his mother's screams echoing across a plantation that would never acknowledge its crimes, and of countless men, women, and children whose names were erased long before laws were rewritten. The world moved forward, but the scars remained, embedded in bodies, families, and institutions. Josiah understood that history had a habit of smoothing over suffering, turning lived horrors into distant facts, and he resisted that erasure by continuing to speak whenever his strength allowed. Age did not soften his understanding of injustice, it sharpened it. He warned audiences that emancipation without education, land, and protection would leave formerly enslaved people vulnerable to new forms of exploitation, and time would prove him right. As Reconstruction faltered and racial violence persisted, Josiah recognized familiar patterns of power reshaping themselves rather than disappearing. Yet he refused to surrender to bitterness. Instead, he focused on legacy, on what could be preserved, taught, and passed on. He continued supporting communities of former slaves in Canada, places that stood as living counter-arguments to the lie that black people could not govern themselves. These settlements were imperfect and struggled with poverty and discrimination, but they represented autonomy, dignity, and collective survival. Josiah believed deeply that memory itself was a form of resistance, that forgetting was the final victory of oppression. His autobiography was written not to glorify himself, but to correct the record, to insist that enslaved people were thinkers, planners, and moral agents, not passive objects shaped solely by cruelty. Yet, despite his efforts, popular culture moved in a different direction. The image of Uncle Tom evolved over time into a caricature, twisted into an insult that mocked perceived submissiveness, a cruel irony that deeply troubled Josiah's legacy. The very story meant to expose the brutality of slavery became, in some contexts, a tool for minimizing black resistance. Josiah's real life, marked by defiance, intelligence, and leadership, was largely absent from that conversation. This gap between symbol and reality reflected a broader failure of historical memory, a preference for narratives that comfort rather than challenge. Josiah aged with the awareness that he might never receive widespread recognition, but he also understood that truth does not require popularity to endure. He measured success not by how many knew his name, but by how many lives were changed through his actions. Former slaves who found safety because of his guidance, children who learned to read in communities he helped build, families who stayed together because he showed them that escape was possible. These were the markers of his impact. In his final years, he lived quietly, his body slowing while his mind remained sharp, still reflecting on the strange journey from plantation to freedom, from anonymity to influence without fame. He died in 1883, far from the place of his birth, leaving behind a story that history only partially told. Long after his death, scholars would rediscover his writings, connect the lines between his life and the novel that reshaped public opinion, and begin to restore his presence in the historical record. Yet even today, his name remains unfamiliar to many who know Uncle Tom's Cabin intimately. This imbalance speaks volumes about how societies remember suffering, often elevating fictional representations while overlooking the real human beings who endured and resisted oppression. Josiah Henson's life challenges that tendency. His story refuses to fit neatly into a single moral lesson or character archetype. He was not defined by obedience, nor was he a simple martyr. He was a man shaped by violence who chose purpose over despair, a survivor who became a leader, a witness who understood that freedom is not a moment but a process that demands vigilance. Remembering Josiah Henson is not merely an act of historical correction, it is an ethical responsibility. His life exposes the depth of slavery's cruelty and the strength of those who endured it, while also warning against the dangers of forgetting the human sources behind powerful stories. In acknowledging him, we confront the uncomfortable truth that progress often borrows from suffering without honoring its origin. Josiah Henson's legacy lives not in monuments or widespread fame, but in the enduring reminder that real change is built by people whose names are too easily lost, and that history, when told honestly, must make room for the full complexity of lives like his.